At the end of the day, it's not about what you have or even what you've accomplished. It's about what you've done with those accomplishments. It's about who you've lifted up, who you've made better. It's about what you've given back. Denzel Washington. Welcome to Inspire Vision. Our sole purpose is to elevate the lives of others and to inspire you to do the same.
Barb, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Dr. Doug. I'm really excited to be here.
Oh, it's great. I'm glad we were able to connect on this. So
Yeah.
let the audience know who you are and the background
Right.
behind
Okay.
why you are at the point you are.
Okay. So my name is Barb Nangle. I am a boundaries coach. I'm a former people pleaser, rescuer, fixer, enabler, saver, enabler, codependent person. And when I was 52 in 2015, I hit a codependent bottom, and I didn't know what that word meant. I had never heard it, despite having been in therapy since about age 15, reading a gajillion self-help books, doing like workshops, workbooks, spiritual, like you name it. I was trying. And I was shocked to learn that as this very introspective person I am, I hadn't heard the word codependent. And I learned that it's sort of a constellation of things, but the theme is that people who are codependent focus on that which is outside of themselves. So we're often really more concerned with other people, what they're doing, what they're saying, what they're thinking about us, and really end up neglecting ourselves because we're so focused externally. And I ended up through a series of serendipitous events landing in 12-step recovery for codependence, and very quickly realized I think I need to be reparented, but I didn't know that reparenting was a thing. I thought I'd made that up. And then a few weeks into my codependence recovery, I went to go visit a friend a few hours away who had been in Alcoholics Anonymous for over 10 years. And she had raved since I met her about how radically her life was changed. So I said, "Hey, I've been going to this 12-step meeting, CODA." And she said, let's see if we can find a CODA meeting locally and we'll go. And she couldn't. But she found an ACA meeting, Dr. Doug, which I knew of as ACOA, Adult Children of Alcoholics. It never occurred to me that I qualified, but she qualified. So I was like, I'll go for you. And I walk in and they say, we reparent ourselves. And I was like, what? And then they read the list of the 14 traits of an adult child, excuse me, which is affectionately called the laundry list. And I thought at the time that I qualified for 7 of them. It turns out it's really 13. I was in such denial about my own dysfunction and the dysfunction of my family. And I learned in this meeting that the name of the group is actually Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families. So for that program, I qualified. So I started going to that program. And about a year into it, I decided to let go of CODA because it wasn't a great fit. And it turned out that was a higher powered moment because I ended up going into Overeaters Anonymous and going on the night that I had been going to CODA. I'm now down over 100 pounds from my top weight. I've been at my goal weight for over 6 years. And all of that self-help and therapy and stuff that I did before recovery, the way I think of it, Dr. Doug, is it scratched the surface of the iceberg of my life, and 12-step recovery melted the iceberg of my life. So for me, the 12 steps are where it's at. I think there is so much wisdom in 12-step recovery that is just not making its way out into the world, which is why I started my podcast, which is called Fragmented to Whole: Life Lessons from 12-Step Recovery. There was so much about me, like that I didn't have boundaries. I grew up in a dysfunctional family. I had intergenerational dysfunction, childhood trauma. I had unrealistic expectations of myself, other people in the world. I was deeply entrenched in victim mentality, and that was by far the biggest paradigm shift of my recovery. I was a dishonest person. I truly believed I was an honest person. I lied all the time about things like cigarettes and drugs and alcohol, but mainly in the people-pleasing department, and just many other things that just came up very easily in the first 2 years of recovery. And as a codependent, and I think of the codependence as my core wound, boundaries is kind of the antidote to that. So because of that, learning how to build healthy boundaries was such a game changer for me that when I ultimately started my own business, I decided to niche as a boundaries coach because boundaries permeate every area of our lives. And even though I always had high self-esteem, I always kind of liked myself. When I got in recovery, I could see, that was not the behavior of a woman who felt worthy. That was not the behavior of a woman who loved herself. And I did know that I didn't trust myself. And so there were many, many gifts of boundaries, but I learned to really love myself. I built self-trust and I came to feel worthy. And I had been in a string of dysfunctional romantic relationships my entire life. And then when I was 55, 3.5 years into my recovery, I met my sweetheart. We're still together. We've been together for 5.5 years. And I am in a very healthy, loving, wonderful relationship with this man that I just was not capable of in the past. But I thought that it was them the whole time. So I could go on and on. I feel like I've given you enough sort of fodder
Okay.
here to understand, my story and my transformation and that sort of thing, and why I do what I do.
You have, and one of the things that I want to really, if you don't mind, and if it's not too sensitive, and you can say no if you want
Mhm.
to, but what I find is for a lot of listeners that have experienced just horrific childhood situations, you
Mhm.
tell me you were in therapy at a very young age. Are you okay to kind of share in general what you went through as a child? Because I want
Mhm.
people to be able to see that if they're
Yeah.
going through similar situations, that there is
Mhm.
hope.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I want to answer that question by saying when I first got into ACA, I didn't know that it was a trauma recovery program. So it's a trauma recovery program where you reparent yourself and you use the 12 steps to recover. And I'm hearing trauma, and I was like, when I was 17, my dad tried to strangle me and I moved out, and it happened again when I was 18. I knew that that was traumatic, Dr. Doug. That was pretty clear. But I also was like, well, I was almost an adult. It wasn't childhood. So that doesn't count. And I kept hearing other people, and it was very clear to me that objectively, I did not have it as bad as the other people in the room. I didn't get physically abused other than the attempts to strangle me. I wasn't told that I was a piece of crap. I wasn't told I was going to amount to anything, but it was very clear that I had those traits that I mentioned. And then when I heard that the absence of good things happening can cause trauma, I was like, oh, that makes sense to me. And I've since heard that trauma can result from unmet needs. So that's when I stopped fighting against I belong here, even though I knew I belonged, but I just kept kind of making excuses for why I didn't. So what happened for me is what I call the drip, drip, drip of emotional invalidation. I was not really allowed to have the feelings that naturally came to me from sometimes being a scared little kid or a worried little kid. And my parents gaslit me. So I know that that's a term people are throwing around a lot lately. And for me, what that means is they would say things that were just not true. So I'll give you an example. My mom secretly smoked cigarettes. And one time, and as we knew it as kids, but of course we didn't talk about it. And that is really crazy making for children. But I remember one time my brother going into the room. She used to smoke in her bathroom off of her room. And he went into the room and he goes, "It smells like smoke in here." And she goes, "No, it doesn't. That's the bathroom spray." So this is what I remember, right? No, God only knows how many other times we were told what you perceive is not what's happening. And for me, Dr. Doug, the worst effect of growing up in a dysfunctional family was questioning my own perception. Is this real? Did this really happen? And how can you have a high quality life where you thrive when you question your own perception?
Yes.
about, do I trust my mom? Do I not? Is this real? Did this happen? That sort of thing. So that's really the description of what happened for me. And when I learned the term relational trauma, it was like things clicked into place for me. Like, oh, so it's not big T trauma, like a blunt event. It's little T trauma. That's something that happens continually over time.
Well, and I think that we all go through that because I love the word perception. Because as you
Mm.
think of a child, what you went through, I would assume is, as you said, that perception of it's my reality. It then becomes I'm really not anywhere. I'm not worthwhile. I'm this type of thing. And many
Mhm.
children, and we're all guilty of this as parents. We will say
Mhm.
something not being aware that the perception of the child is going to
Mhm.
be far different than
Mhm.
what we were actually saying. So the words we use, the body language, all of those
Mhm.
types of things, the tonality,
Mhm.
I think are so important for parents to understand that you've
Mhm.
got to be aware of what is the child's perception, and maybe a little communication would help in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of
And
the, go ahead.
I just want to add one other thing. I think a lot of that, like the innocent things that adults do with children, comes from the fact that kids are really concrete and adults are not. So when I was little, my great aunt always had candy at her house and she was single. And to me, candy was for kids. And I was like, why do you always have candy? And she said, I have a sweet tooth. Well, I was so little that I thought it meant she had a specific tooth in her mouth that she had to, like, I don't know, put candy on or something like that. And it wasn't until I
Yeah.
was a teenager that I was like, oh, it means I like sweets is what it means, right? But I carved that idea into my head about a sweet tooth, and I just let that idea stay in my head until one day in my teenagehood, I was like, that's crazy. Oh, it means I like sweets. So that's an innocent example, but multiply that times how many times do we say things to kids?
Well, yeah, and it's interesting. I also love how you talked about codependency. One of the interesting things that I have found is I'm a behavioral analyst also, so I
Mhm.
use very much an assessment to help people. And what I found is that there's a particular personality style that lends itself towards codependency. And it really is, when we get into it, we talk about ways of communicating, what's the greatest fear, what's the greatest strength, and so forth. Greatest fear with this particular personality is abandonment,
Mhm.
the relationships. And so they tend to stay in those relationships. And as you say, disregard boundaries because the
Mhm.
fear is greater. The fear of
Mhm.
abandonment is greater than the fear of the unknown.
Right, exactly. And it's funny that you mentioned abandonment because that is the core wound of adult children is that most of us have been emotionally abandoned. Some of us have been literally abandoned, whether it's not the typical you were left on a church doorstep or at the fire station. It could be, your parents separated, or it could be your parents were never home, or they just emotionally abandoned you. And unfortunately for adult children is the thing we fear the most, abandonment is the thing we do to ourselves. So if you're in a relationship that is dysfunctional and you stay in it because you're afraid that they're going to leave you and you people please and you say things are okay that are not okay, etc., and you compromise your values, you are abandoning yourself. So you've really built abandonment into the relationship because you're not really there. This fake version of you is there. And so the relationship is doomed to fill that need of closeness and intimacy that we're actually seeking, which is the opposite of abandonment. And this is why in the ACA program, we say the solution is to become your own loving parent. In other words, to give yourself, to backfill that love that you missed as a child. And what I found, Dr. Doug, is that when I stopped abandoning myself, I stopped being afraid of abandonment from other people because I'm not abandoned. And then I don't know if everybody knows this, but 12-step programs are spiritual programs. And that means we find a power greater than ourselves. I personally call my higher power God. Not everybody does. But when you stopped abandoning yourself and you also feel like you have a connection with a higher power, you're like, doubly, maybe we could even say quadruply not abandoned. And so you don't go out into the world in this grasping way of like, don't abandon me, don't abandon me, don't abandon me. You find somebody who matches a much healthier, non-grasping version of you. And for me, I learned like learning to build healthy boundaries was one of the many ways that I learned to stop abandoning myself. I learned to show up for myself, to follow through for myself, to say the truth about what was okay and what was not okay. And it's a process that you go through. I personally happened to go through like this meandering, haphazard process over 2 to 3 years in recovery. In the beginning, I didn't even know that I was building boundaries. And what I've done is, I did a lot of reading about boundaries after that and sort of retroactively understood what I did. And as I was reading, I would draw images to visually depict like what did that look like to me because I'm a pretty visual person. And those images turned into handouts, which turned into a workbook, which that's the spine of my boundaries coaching program. So I've figured out like what are the qualities, what's the essence of what you need to build boundaries in a matter of weeks rather than a matter of months. And essentially, I coach people who are former me, because I'm like, I know what it's like to look like you have it together on the outside. Meanwhile, internally, you're a mess and probably have a series of dysfunctional relationships, or you're continually saying no when you really want to say yes, and you're neglecting yourself because you're so focused on other people. Like those are the typically women that I work with that are like that because I want to help former me because I wish I had a me to coach me through this process.
Well, and you talk about a lot of things. You talk about ACA, and for the
Mhm.
audience, could you explain exactly what does that stand for, ACA?
Yeah. So it stands for Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families. It was started in 1978 by some teens who had grown out of the Alateen program, which is a program for teenagers who are children of alcoholics. And they outgrew that program, but they didn't want to go to Al Anon, which is an adult program for loved ones of alcoholics. And because they were like, those our parents are in the room, we don't want to be in the room with them. We feel like there's something qualitatively different about growing up in an alcoholic or otherwise dysfunctional family.
Right.
It was originally named Adult Children of Alcoholics because they were just adult children of alcoholics. And over time, the name was changed to include dysfunctional families because it became clear there are a variety of types of dysfunction that result in the same traits. So you could grow up in a super militaristic family, a family where there's chronic illness or mental illness or personality disorder of a parent. Maybe you move a ton. It could be like a hyper religious family. There's all kinds of types of families that can result in having the same traits as adult children of alcoholics. So that's why they expanded and call it they say, and dysfunctional families now. And it's a 12-step program, which the 12 steps started with Alcoholics Anonymous in the late 30s. And there are now literally hundreds of 12-step recovery programs.
Well, and as you talk about this specific one, because obviously it worked for you, what
Mhm.
what are the 12 steps? Is it something that is easy to remember, or what are they exactly?
I could probably recite them. I could also pull them up, but like step one is we're powerless over, whatever the thing, like in Alcoholics Anonymous, is we're powerless over alcohol and our lives have become manageable. In ACA, it's we're powerless over the effects of family dysfunction and our lives have become unmanageable. And so what we say in ACA is the main effects are fear and distorted thinking. So because I grew up in a dysfunctional family, I am going to have some distorted thinking. For example, I can't trust my perception. I couldn't trust my perception as a kid. Or here's another distorted thinking. If I abandon myself enough, people will love me. That is some really serious distorted thinking. And then step two is came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And ACA, we sometimes say, could restore us to clarity because we never had sanity maybe. And
Right.
I didn't know that I was confused much of my life until I got in recovery and I looked back and I was like, oh my God, I was confused all the time because I couldn't trust my own perception. And then step 3 is became willing to turn our will and our lives over to a power greater than ourselves. And that for me, even though I identified as a spiritual person when I got into recovery, and as I said, I call my higher power God, I didn't use God. In other words, I didn't turn my will and my life over to God. I didn't ask God for guidance. I didn't say, God, please show me your will for me. And when I started doing that, it was like the weight of not the weight of the world, the weight of the universe was taken off of me, because I always felt like I had to have an answer. I had to know things. I had to figure stuff out on my own. And when I started being able to hand stuff over, it was amazing. So, and then step 4 is where we say we take a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. And this is so that we can really get to know, what have I been doing in my life that has been creating chaos, or maybe exacerbating the already existing chaos, creating dysfunction. And I think for me, this is the step that got me to come out of victim mentality, that got me to see that I had that victim mentality I was telling you about, and got me to come out of it. Because it's not like I was walking around going, you're to blame, you're to blame, you're to blame, but I was living in blame of other people. I really thought, for example, in all my relationships, well, if he would just fill in the blank, then everything would be okay, which meant that I was acting like I got nothing to do with the status of any of my relationships. And actually, here's a funny little story. I thought that I was responsible for all of the good things in all my relationships. And then he, whoever he was responsible for all the bad things. Now, when I say that, on the face of it, that's ridiculous. Like, how could that possibly be
Right.
so? It wasn't a conscious thought that I had. It came up to my consciousness when I did the 12 steps of recovery, because I was taking the searching and fearless moral inventory of my life. And it was like, I mean, come on, that's insane that I could possibly be responsible for all the good things and then he could be responsible for all of the bad things. That just doesn't make any sense. And so I think that that has a lot to do with why I was able to come out of victim mentality. And the thing is, when you learn that you're the problem, you get to be the solution. So for some people, they learn they're the problem. They use it as a reason to beat themselves up. To me, it's empowering, because if I'm the problem, then I get to be the solution, and I get to stop waiting for other people to change.
Well, and it's interesting as you're talking about this, you talk about step 4 where you're really doing that introspective work and really
Mhm.
accepting responsibility, which I think
Mhm.
is key for anyone. But what's
Absolutely.
fascinating to me is with this 12-step program, they've got a few foundational things that they have included, which is normally, as far as I can tell, not necessarily included in most therapy or help. And that's this whole sense of godliness and, that type of thing.
Mhm.
And do you find that people kind of push away against that? Have you observed that?
Yeah, absolutely. So some people get really turned off by the whole higher power thing. And unfortunately, it is a deal breaker for some people, but I can also tell you, I have met numerous people, especially people that have been in recovery for decades, that came in as staunch atheists. And just by just saying, I'm going to put that aside right now and not worry, but I'm going to do the behaviors of the people who have what I want. So if those people pray, even if I don't believe it works, I'm going to start praying. If those people hand things over to a power greater than themselves, I'm going to do it. And they saw effects that were undeniable. And so, and what I say to people is, it just has to be a power greater than you. It does not have to be divine. It doesn't have to be, it could be nature, it could be universe, it could be the process of evolution, it could be entropy, it could be the ocean, like just something that is more powerful than you, that you can say, listen, I'm going to turn this over to you so that I can let go of responsibility. There are people who, even when they stay in recovery for a long time, continue to be staunch atheists, and they find other ways. Some people say it's the power of the group that is greater than me. It is the power of the 12 steps that is greater than me. Whatever they need to do. I know in my ACA program, there is a movement afoot of some people that are working to try to find some literature that is not grounded in higher power that works for them, and like all the power to them. My personal belief and experience based on what I've seen in my own recovery and all of the other people, I've been in ACA for 9 years and OA for 8 years. I don't believe that it's possible to really recover through the 12 steps without having some kind of a higher power. But I think that you really hit on something here. I think there's a few reasons why 12-step recovery is so powerful and why it worked so well for me, whereas nothing else did before. One is the spiritual nature of the program. Like, I'm part of something greater than myself, and I cannot deny that. And acknowledging that and participating in that helps me in ways that nothing else can. Two, I'm in a group of other people who have had similar experiences to me. We're all on different timelines in the path, but there are people who've been here longer than me, and they've done something that I've never been able to do before, which has changed these long-standing patterns of my life that haven't served me. So I want to know what they've been doing. And the third thing is that there's this stepwise nature, the 12 steps. You do them in order. You don't go step 1, step 4, step 7. You go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And they've been proven for decades to work for so many people. And so I think, those three things together really, really help. And then we have all of these like slogans and tools and tips and tricks that just are like, it seems to me they're not making their way out into the world, because there was so much I did not know about myself until recovery. And what's crazy is that I was trying, and I was introspective, and I was trying to do whatever work was put in front of me or that I sought out. And it just wasn't, I got little dribs and drabs of stuff here and there. And all those therapists I work with, they were mainly sounding boards. I got a couple of book recommendations over the years, and they might occasionally ask me a fruitful question, but nothing to see my patterns and change them like recovery did.
Yes, and then I think that's a common experience for people. One of the things you said that's a little bit opposite of what you had said before, so I want to clarify for the audience, because as you were talking about the higher power and talked about the fact that therefore I'm not responsible, and yet one of the key areas, number 4, is to take responsibility for your emotions. So can you clarify what you meant by that? Because I think so many people put everything on another, if it's a higher power, well, this is God's will, this is how it's supposed to be, and not take the responsibility to live their lives in a positive way.
Yeah. So I have a saying from recovery that I think will get at the heart of what you're saying is God can move mountains, but I have to bring the shovel. Right? God doesn't have arms and legs. So I have to be like God's hands and feet on the earth. So when it comes to feelings, in the beginning of my recovery, the things I handed over most frequently to God were my feelings and my thoughts. I didn't know that I ruminated and catastrophized, even though I've always been an introspective person and always thought of myself as a very positive, motivating, inspired person. I had all kinds of negative stuff going on. So I was like, all right, God, I'm going to hand this over to you. These feelings feel like way too much for me. I need you to take them from me. And it was just this relief that I'm not alone. So it's not necessarily that I'm negating any responsibility that I have. It's that I have this glorious partner, my higher power that I choose to call God, that is helping me with these things. I felt 100% responsible for everything around me 24/7, 365 days a year in all cases. So I felt the need to have it together all the time and to never let anybody know that I didn't know something, that I wasn't capable of something, or that I had flaws. And I was able to let go of that because I'm like, I literally can't do that. And so does that answer your question?
That does. And so number 4 is the responsibility part. What's number 5?
So 5 is admitted to ourselves, to another human being, and a higher power, the exact nature of our wrongs. So we share what came up in this inventory with someone else. So we're not just
Mhm.
sharing it with ourselves. We're not keeping it in the dark. Of course, our higher power knows it all anyway, but to share that and then to share it with another human being. Some people are absolutely terrified of this.
Oh,
To
yeah.
me, one of the things we say in ACA, it's the shame buster. Because when you sit and you tell another person the things that you think are the worst things you have ever done in your entire life, and they say, I see you, I get you, I love you. There is nothing like that. I will tell you, the third time that I did the 12 steps, I shared something which I'm comfortable sharing here and now that I did when I was 12 years old. My little brother was 4. My older brother was a year and a half older than me. Me and my older brother and another kid. I don't know what we were doing, but we took my little brother, we put him in a sleeping bag, rolled it up, put him in a closet, shut the door, and then we hid from him like we were afraid of him. And he practically suffocated. And I still have some pretty strong feelings about how horrible that was. To me, that is hands down the worst thing I have ever done in my entire life. And I can't even imagine the impact on my little brother. So I fell on the floor, sobbing the third time that I did the 12 steps. And I had shared this twice before, but I never had this effect. I fell on the floor sobbing. And my friend that I was sharing this with stood above me and pointed down at to me. And she said, Barb, God loves you. God loves you no more and no less right now. And I got to tell you, Dr. Doug, I felt like I was a gaping wound, and the love of God was poured into that gaping wound. And I was healed in a way that nothing could ever have done. And then I'm going to jump forward to step 8, which is
Okay.
where we make amends to people, except when to do so could cause harm to them or others. And a lot of people are really terrified about this too. And so I want to start by saying we get to be considered the others. So I'm not going to put myself in harm's way. Like if somebody was abusive to me, I'm not going to go to them and make amends to them in person if I'm going to put myself at risk. So I have to make some kind of indirect amends. What I found when I made amends for things was that I felt like I cleaned that stuff off of my soul. So I'll give you an example. There was a woman, a young woman, when I was in high school that I bullied. I didn't even have an awareness that that was bullying until I did the 12 steps. And there was another woman that I bullied in the workplace when I was a young adult. And I couldn't find these people. And I happened to, I think this was a higher power moment, run into a guy who was a retired private detective. And I went to him and I said, John, I've tried Google, I've tried Facebook, I can't find these women. Do you have any suggestions for how I might find these people so I can make amends to them? And he goes, well, you didn't know this, but I'm also in 12-step recovery. And so I know what you're doing. I'm happy to do it for free for you. And I was like, oh my God. And he said, the only thing is, if they don't want to hear from you, you have to take that as an answer. And I was like, absolutely. I said, well, here's the thing. If they don't want to hear from me directly, then ask if they would be willing to allow me to write a letter that you give to them. So in 48 hours, he came back to me, Dr. Doug. One woman gave her phone number, and the other one said, give me a letter through Dr. Doug. So I gave him the letter on a Friday, and on Saturday, I called the woman, the phone number. I got her voicemail. When I hung up that phone, I started sobbing. I didn't even know that was coming. I just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And it was a sobbing of relief and of gratitude. That's when I had that feeling of I cleaned it off of my soul. And I was working with my sponsor in Overeaters Anonymous at the time. And he said to me, Barb, no wonder you've lost weight because you've lost weight. You've lost the weight of this burden. Now, I had no idea that those feelings were inside of me until I made that phone call, which by the way, I got her voicemail. I did not get her in person, and
Mhm.
she never called me back. But I got the release of taking responsibility for what I did to harm another human being and say that was wrong. I never should have done that. You didn't deserve to be treated that way, and I am sorry. And I have spent my adult life making up for it in these ways. And like, I've never done anything like that outside of 12-step recovery.
Wow, that's amazing. And, we could go into all of these different steps, but I think you've hit on some of the real important ones. But I want to
Mhm.
get to what you actually do as far as boundaries coaching. Let's talk
Yeah.
about boundaries and what is it that keeps people from setting boundaries and what are the healthy boundaries that we should set? And then what
Yeah.
are some of the unhealthy boundaries that we tend to set?
Yeah. Yeah. So, the main thing that keeps people is feelings. So they feel guilty and shameful. Those are the two most common feelings that stop people. So either they stop them from setting boundaries at all, or they cave when they go to try to set a boundary because they're so riddled with guilt and shame that they can't take it. And, for me, what I used to think when I was back in my codependent days was that I was nice. I'm a nice person. That's why I help people. And when I got in recovery, I learned that I was a people pleaser, didn't know that, and that I was really doing it because I wanted people's approval. And technically for me, it was that I didn't want their disapproval. So I didn't want people to think I was a bad person. And to me, a bad person was someone who says no and is unhelpful. And so for me, the antidote to the guilt and shame isn't a quick fix. It's a little bit more long term. And that is what I do is I start all my clients by having them go through an exercise to identify their top 5 values. And by knowing their values, what matters, what's important, and setting boundaries in alignment with their values, when we start doing that, we get into integrity with ourselves. Integrity is another word for wholeness. And we realize, like, I'm doing this because it brings me in alignment with my highest good. Like, I wouldn't have that set of values if it wasn't for my highest good. So let me use health as an example. If if health is a strong value of yours, you're going to set boundaries in your life such that you support and promote your health. So that might mean things like I set aside time to go to exercise class or to do yoga in the morning, or I pay for a meditation teacher, or I buy equipment, or I avoid going to brunch buffets and eating volumes of food. So if somebody judges you for doing things that are in alignment with your health, it doesn't matter to you as much because I'm doing this because it matters to me and it supports and promotes my health. So in the beginning, when you first start doing it and first start setting boundaries, it's difficult. I would say that me being in a food recovery program helped me a lot with my boundaries because there's a lot of pushers in our society.
Oh, yeah.
And people are really concerned with what you're eating and not eating. So in the beginning, I would say to people, I don't eat sugar. And then they were like, well, do you eat fruit? And do you eat this? And do you eat that? And I was like, I don't really want to answer all those questions. So then I started saying, I don't eat sweets, and then more questions. And I finally started saying, I have food issues. And funny enough, when I say that, nobody probes because nowadays we've got people that are gluten-free, people that are vegan, people that are paleo,
Right.
blah, 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 blah. Nobody asks. So I had to realize what's my boundary in terms of what I'm going to offer people for information. Like I get to decide what I tell people and how much I let people in. And I also had to learn to say no, no, thank you. No, I've said no. Please stop asking me. Like I had to get better for my own health. And if people get offended by that, like I'm going to die if I continue to eat compulsively. So I don't want to die. And that's more important to me than what you think of me. And so that the guilt and the shame are the main reasons that people stop because they have these ideas, like, for example, that I'm hurting someone by setting a boundary. And I think something I also learned in recovery was there's a difference between harming someone and hurting them. So it might hurt you to use a needle to take a splinter out of your finger, but it's not going to harm you. In fact, it's going to heal you. It might hurt someone's feelings to set a boundary with them. It's not going to harm them. It might heal the relationship because you're being honest with them about what's okay and what's not okay. There are some relationships you could actually lose by setting boundaries, and I am of the opinion that you probably should lose them if that's
Yes, I was
the
going to
case.
say, so many
Yeah.
times we surround ourselves with people, and you comment about original values and boundaries set based on those values, and then also boundaries that we tend to set because we think that's what we need to do. So in one case, we are literally at the effect of our environment, and the
Mhm.
other side of the coin is that you literally are in control of your
Mm.
environment.
Yeah.
And you find a lot of people tend to be at the effect where they're
Oh,
setting boundaries
absolutely.
because that's what they think people need.
Well, I think that when we're at the effect of life, that is victim mentality. That is the belief that the world is acting on me and that I don't have a say and I can't have an impact. So when we, like one way we say in ACA is we become an actor rather than a reactor in our life, or we act on life rather than reacting to it. So it is true that there are sometimes you're going to set a boundary as a reaction. And I think that would be like if something just came at you and you weren't expecting it. But most of the time, boundaries are proactive. And I think, a myth about boundaries is that they're walls. And I will say, like, if you have a violent or toxic or inebriated person in your life, you need a wall with that person. So in cases like that, yes, a boundary is the wall. Most of the time, boundaries are not like walls. They're really flexible. And one metaphor that I use, which many people do, is that a boundary is like having a fence with a gate in it. And the gate opens from the inside only. In other words, you're the gatekeeper. And if someone is trampling on your property, it's because you let them
Let them
in.
in.
They climbed the fence, you let them in. And so you're in charge. If they're trampling on your property, then it's up to you to do something about it. You have to provide some kind of a consequence. Like, what are you going to do if they don't honor your boundary? And so often, people don't honor a boundary because they don't believe you, because you've never done it, or they forgot, or maybe they have horrible boundaries themselves. And so it's really your job to enforce them. And so in some circumstances, all you're going to do is just repeat it and they'll be like, "Oh, okay." But sometimes we have to change something. So I'll give an example probably everybody can identify with. Nowadays, it's really uncommon for people to smoke in other people's houses. So we
Right.
don't typically have to have a rule that we state out loud, no smoking in my house. So if somebody walks in your house and they light up a cigarette, you might say, "Hey, we don't allow smoking in our house." And if they continue to smoke and you do nothing, it's not really a boundary because you're not doing anything about it. But if it's an actual boundary, then the consequence would be that you ask them to put it out and not smoke again. And if they won't put it out, then you walk them out the door. And perhaps you say, "I'm afraid you're not going to be invited back again because you can't honor my request to not smoke in my house." Like that's a pretty obvious one that most people can understand, but it's the same with other things. And where it gets tricky is where we're telling ourselves this is my boundary, but we're actually trying to control other people. So I'll give you an example of my own recovery. So when
Okay.
I got into recovery and I started building boundaries, I thought that I could just say, "This is my boundary," and then people would respect it. So my older brother is a very loud person and he like lives and breathes politics. And even though he and I agree politically, I'm done. I don't want to talk about it. I don't participate in the news and politics because it's not good for my mental health. So I thought I could just say, "Hey, I really, your loudness is hurting my ears. Can you talk quieter?" He's not capable. I'm really not interested in talking about politics. Let's talk about something else. He's literally not capable, Dr. Doug. He's just not. And so I realized, oh, I'm the one that doesn't want to talk politics. I can't turn him into a quiet person. I can't turn him into a person that doesn't talk politics. So what am I going to do about it? Well, what I did was I spent less time with him. So that meant I saw him less frequently and I saw him for shorter periods of time because I literally can't control him. I cannot turn him into a person that talks quietly and doesn't talk politics. And so that's an example of, in the beginning, I was trying to control him by saying, talk quietly and don't talk politics. That's not possible. So then what am I going to do? And so I can let go of being annoyed at him and resentful of him because he talks so loud and he talks politics all the time, because that's who he is. I get to accept him. And as the Serenity Prayer says, I get to accept the things I cannot change. And I need the courage to change the things I can. So I didn't tell him I'm going to stop coming less frequently and for shorter periods of time. I could have said, if you don't stop talking politics, I'm not going to come around as much. But I chose not to, because that's what I wanted. I didn't feel like I needed to explain. And I'm pretty clear. He's incapable of not talking about politics.
Wow, that's a great example. And as we get to the close here, this has been amazing. Time goes by so quickly. It
does. I can't believe it.
Floors me.
Yeah.
It floors me. So if there was a message you really want to share with the audience, just in a short message, what would that be?
So it would be, keep the focus on yourself, because you're the only thing you can control. And I have 4 suggested ways to do that. 1, ask yourself, what do I want or need in this situation? I never did that. 2, mind your own business. Let other people live their lives. Stop giving unsolicited advice. 3, ask yourself, what might I have been doing to contribute to this situation, and or what might I do differently? In recovery, we call that, what is my part? And number 4, take really good care of yourself. People with poor boundaries are famous for neglecting themselves and trying to pour from an empty cup. I want you to pour from the overflow. And the only way you're going to have an overflow is if you fill your cup first. It is not selfish to take care of yourself. It's self-preservation.
Love it. Barb, thanks so much for this. Has just been fascinating for me, and I'm sure for the folks that are going to listen to it. So I really appreciate you being on the show. How do people find you, real quick?
So my favorite place to hang out on social media is Instagram. I'm at Higher Power Coaching. My podcast you can find on any podcast outlet, or you can go to fragmentedtowhole.com. And if you go to Instagram, every link to me, whether you want to do a boundaries call with me, find out about my coaching and that sort of thing, is all linked in the bio on Instagram.
Great. Hey, thank you so much. And folks, thanks for listening. I hope you really enjoyed this, and reach out if you, this is an area that I've never come across before. So this sounds really interesting, and I hope people will reach out and see if there's a solution that they haven't been able to achieve yet. So anyway, folks, this is Dr. Doug. Have a wonderful week. Saying namaste.
Namaste.